Hey guys, Nick Cutroneo here and welcome back to my YouTube channel. This is video number 23 in my video progress series of Saudade No. 3 by Roland Dyens. So I'm actually filming this part of the video a day late. I forgot that I didn't actually film my wrap up and speaking on this practice. So this video is a day later than when I actually played it, if that makes sense. So my focus with this third section, the finale, was on two main things. The first is getting the piece up to 240 to the 16th note. And so just in general playing it faster. The end of it really broke down. So my memory really broke down on that end part. So I made sure to give about 10 minutes of just singing letter names and counting it for it to sort of resettle and get itself back to where it needed to be. And that worked out really well. The one thing that I notice is that as I am more comfortable with that section, the more that I am actually playing it at the right pacing, where I'm not slowing it down, because I think I'm slowing it down mainly because I'm trying to figure out what comes next. After 10 minutes of that, I spent the rest of my 20 minutes actually working backwards in this piece. So that's a very common practice tool to use, where you go from the end of a section back towards the beginning. And I did that with a very specific purpose, because the end, that last piece, is probably the most finger intense aspect of this piece. And again, that section is part of my excerpt practice, the last 3 or 4 lines or so. But something that I was really working on was really making sure that right hand fingering was really spot on. Not that I'm using wrong fingers, but I feel like the right hand fingers weren't really accurately getting to the strings. And something that I just on a whim decided to try a different fingering. So the initial fingering for the section that I'm talking about is this thumb, I, slur, thumb, A, M, thumb, I, slur, thumb, A, M, thumb. And what I decided is that I'm not going to use A and M. It just always tightens up. Especially the index finger when I need to have that back out again. So interestingly enough, in that whole section, using thumb, I, thumb, M-I actually worked better. And even though I have to really quickly exchange that I finger, having that I finger sort of being used actually allows for a quicker exchange than if I was going to use thumb, A, M, thumb, I. So that's just a weird quirk that, you know, you would think that limiting the use of the I finger would make more sense, so that way the I finger wouldn't be as necessarily, I don't want to say tired, but you being used too much. You've got, you know, 3 other fingers that you can use, and you can throw in the A finger. Spacing wise, it makes a lot of sense in the right hand rather than doing, you know, this, then bringing that kind of thing. Because that then introduces the potential issue of an error in terms of playing the wrong note with the I finger as you're making that transition. But from a perspective of what fingering works best in my hand at this given moment, that M-I instead of A-M works way better. And it was one of those things where, like, I was able to do it and immediately it was at 240. It was sloppy, but it was immediately at 240 where I wasn't struggling with it. And I'm like, okay, that's my answer. So that just goes to show you why a specific fingering choice, whether it's given in the music or one that you make, why you can ultimately change it, why there are so many different variables on it, depends on the individual, depends on what their strength and what their weaknesses are. Now, I am going to preface that by saying that if you are, if you're playing this piece, you're technically at a level where those decisions can become more personal, okay? This isn't a piece that I would give to, you know, a first semester freshman. This isn't a piece that I would give to a, you know, young student who hasn't been playing for a while. But if you're technically at the level of this piece where you can hang with it and you're not struggling to learn the notes, you're not struggling to play it, you can make these fingering. You probably, one, know what fingering choices work best for your hand. 2, you're in a position where you can experiment with fingerings. If I was working with a student and they were working on a piece where a fingering decision wasn't quite working for them, depending on their level, if they're at the level that you need to be at with this piece, I would look for another fingering choice. If the fingering choice was specifically created so that way they're working on a given concept or issue, then obviously I'm not going to change that fingering because I want them to work that out. I want them to practice it. I want them to develop that technique. So changing fingerings is one of those things where I'm definitely, I would say, more down the middle, and it depends on the situation, depends on the level of the student, and depends on what they're trying to accomplish in the given piece. With my students, 9 times out of 10, I'm actually giving them fingering for the pieces that they're working on. And the reason for that is that those are pieces that I probably have worked on or that I've worked out fingering, and so I'm giving them what I feel is the best fingering for whatever given section there is. I've actually probably gone over all the different possible combinations and ultimately came to this decision. So from the perspective of teacher working with a student, to me it's very important for them to follow fingering to a point. There's something that we're trying to accomplish with that fingering, depending on what level and their length of time with the instrument is. If I was working with a student on this piece, I'd be more prone to change fingering because they probably have a lot of the technique necessary to play. And you know, that fingering combination, for instance, of using thumb AM versus thumb MI, is not going to make or break their existence as a guitar player. Now, if that student felt like, well, I really want to make sure that my AM is working, that's a great excerpt repertoire example to work on that issue in a more complex arpeggio example. And for me, it becomes ultimately, well, when are you playing the piece? If you're playing the piece in like 2 or 3 weeks, maybe changing the fingering is a smart idea, especially if that fingering works immediately, which is the situation that I'm in, where I'm playing this piece, performing this piece for everybody on June 30th via live stream. So that fingering change was partly made due to when I'm playing the piece, and that it's coming up pretty soon. The other thing is, you know, making your life easier for whatever given moment. So a good example of this is when I was in grad school, I was working on the Tedesco Quintet for string quartet and guitar. And there was, in the first movement, there's this big scale passage that happens, and it's 16th notes. The first 2 16th notes are slurred, followed by 2 articulated 16th notes. So in the right hand, you have 3 attacks in every beat. So the fingering that I was working on was just alternating back and forth between I and M, and the way that the notes were grouped and everything, every other string crossing was a bad one. No matter what finger you started on, because it just sort of was the way that it worked out. The solution to that bad string crossing was to actually use the fingering A, slur, M-I, A, slur, M-I, and so on and so forth. And in preparing the piece, you know, I've been practicing this section with I and M, and it just wasn't working. It just was not happening. And so my teacher suggests a different fingering. And I would say I probably had the performance 2 weeks later of the full piece. And I said to him very, you know, matter of fact, well, shouldn't I be able to do the other one? Shouldn't I be able to just alternate between I and M? And he looked at me and he said, yeah, you should be able to. But the other fingering works better for you. You can immediately play this passage way better with that new fingering. And you're not really working at it. You already have the speed and the coordination in that second fingering that I just gave you. Now, if you want to be able to do it I and M, you can take that out of the music and you could practice it on its own, sort of as like a little excerpt or etude to develop that. And I was like, oh, that makes perfect sense, because we're balancing, especially as a professional, what we want to be able to do technically and what we're capable of doing at that moment. And so you may intellectually want to be able to use a fingering because maybe you feel like you should be able to do it, but that whole expectation is irrelevant to the fact that one way works and one way doesn't work right now. Funny enough, shoot to almost 10 years later, maybe it was like 7 years later, I performed the piece on a faculty recital at CCSU, Central Connecticut State University, and I'm playing that passage I and M. It just sort of is the way that life works. One fingering, 7 years ago worked really well, and now that fingering, and it was used to replace a fingering that didn't work really well. 7 years later, the original fingering worked really well. So it's one of those things that, other than the ego aspect of I should be able to do this, ultimately it's, well, right now I can't, so let me find another alternative that works best for me. In this particular case, using I and M versus A and M isn't that big of a deal, so I'm not really concerned over I can't do one thing as good as the other. And again, in my hand, what winds up happening is because I is so... If you watch as I play it fast, you can see how slow that I finger is to release. Part of that is in the sequencing of my hand, for lack of a better word, where I really sequence between these two guys. Now I could probably train and work out that release, or just use I and M, and it just works just as well. Because I focused all of my practice time on the last page of this third section, I really didn't get to work on any other aspects of the piece. However, I thought that the work that I did do really solidified that ending of this section. Moving forward with the final performance, I feel it worked way better than it did the first performance. Let's take a listen to the final performance of this piece, and we'll meet back to wrap up. For my next practice session on this piece, I'm going to have two main objectives. The first one is to work on the first two pages, especially the first maybe 4 lines where I have lots of repeated chords with I and M. I really feel that tighten up, especially in my forearm, and I'm going to really work on just getting rid of that tension. It's really hard because it's constantly repeating the same fingers over and over again. I find it hard to keep the articulation the same, where the notes are crisp and can be heard at the soft dynamic, and then also just sort of keeping relaxed while I play that. So that's going to be a focus. and I'll do that through using slow and fast practice. Aside from neatening up areas that just need to be worked on and buttoned up, the other section that I'm going to focus on is the ending, again, of the fast part of this section. Just making sure that the fingering choices that I made are working and that I'm integrating all that stuff really, really well. If you stuck around to the end of this video, thanks a lot, I appreciate it, and please make sure to give it a big thumbs up. If you haven't done so already, please subscribe to my channel and hit that bell notification button so that way you get notified every time I release a new video. Thanks again for watching, everyone, and I'll see you guys in the next video.